With this channel, Altered States of History, we are going to think about history from the inside out. I'm Dr. Courtney Rea, an historian of science interested in the history of consciousness. How people in the past have taken on the mystery of what the mind was, what it could know, what it could do. Questions that go back to antiquity, back to the forest treatises, back to Socrates. But starting in the 1600s, curiosity about the mind gets energized by powerful social and economic forces. Now people want to take possession of their own personal and spiritual identities, know their own minds as never before, and the world will be remade because of it. This is the curiosity that makes us modern. But what about altered states of consciousness? So important to this modern story and to our human story, really, and yet, in so many ways, left out of it. Even though the past is full of people whose extraordinary lives were somehow touched by extraordinary experiences. Prophetic dreams, visions, premonitions, near-death experiences, non-dual states, experiences that, real or not, shaped the people that shaped history, but we don't know how to value them. We approach these phenomena purely as matters of personal belief, something totally contained in the mind. But they're also experiences, and they're far more common than we generally recognize. According to a recent Pew study, 45% of people polled say they have had a sudden sense of overwhelming connection to something from beyond this world. 38% say someone who's passed away has tried to communicate with them. 30% say they have personally encountered, in a more immediate physical sense, some spirit or unseen spiritual force. It's like there's a body of knowledge here that is itself a ghost. The question I want to ask here is why? Why, if so many people have had these kinds of experiences, why do we just accept that there's nothing here to know, nothing here to know, nothing here to know, nothing here to know? At least nothing that can inform our understanding of nature. We just assume that either such phenomena do not exist, or if they do, science cannot observe and learn from them. Isn't that what 100+ years of failed parapsychology proves? Maybe, or maybe, as a society, we really don't want to know anything for sure. We're living in a system where from the start there was this new mathematical model of nature and a new rights-based model of government and a new empirical model of human understanding that all came together to push religious violence out of politics. Not by saying there is no greater supernatural reality, just by denying the human mind any real knowledge of it. Not knowing makes room for everyone's truth equally. Not knowing lets scientific models coexist with all religious possibilities. Not knowing makes for great politics. But you have to ask, does it make for great knowledge? Consider that our most fundamental agreement as citizens is where the possibility of obtaining knowledge comes to an end and personal belief begins. And so far, that has been pegged to a physical boundary. Anything that brings ordinary human perception across that boundary doesn't just upset this or that scientific theory. It upsets the entire social and political order in which science is embedded. And this absolute renunciation of any kind of mystical gnosis or parasensory perception is not only built into our politics from the beginning, but later comes to rely in the late 19th century on scientific conventions about consciousness that might not even be true. Namely, that there is no consciousness. How science defines consciousness matters because we have to think inside that box. And starting in the 1870s, that becomes a very difficult box to think our way out of, because that is when science tried to fit the mind into a mechanical model of nature that had absolutely no room for it. This new evolutionary theory of consciousness viewed the mind as a purely biological adaptation, just nature's way of taking the billions of cells of a multicellular organism, processing millions of environmental stimuli, and turning them into just one thing with one objective: a body that would survive. And that body needed a useful idiot. I feel so alive. Sorry, but you're probably just a data compression algorithm. Now, you might not get a self with this new scientific psychology, but you could always keep whatever version of the soul you choose. So is this new evolutionary materialism a problem for religion or for science? Or really, for all of us? Because what could a self like that ever really know? If the mind's not real, if it's just a phantom effect of physical processes, then that really calls into question the value of mental experience.
Whether we label that experience physical or spiritual. If the mind's not real, neither are its contents.
What do our thoughts and feelings and sensations have to do with a world that doesn't think, feel, or sense? Two ideas come together at the end of the 19th century that will hollow out Enlightenment humanism going forward. Everything we know about the world is really just an appearance in the mind, but the mind does not appear to exist. But if not knowing makes for great politics, what better way to lock that in heading into the 20th century? Of course, there were people, physicists and psychologists, who thought there might be something related to consciousness working at the heart of the quantum world when science first encountered it in the early 20th century, and even curiosity about how unity experiences and other altered states phenomena might illuminate these structures. But that all gets quickly shut down. You can't define a fundamental reality in terms of a non-existent one. So you can see how, once we committed to a psychology without a consciousness, it removed all basis for a universe with one. This new evolutionary consciousness was a box with no windows, lined with mirrors, containing nothing. And we've been stuck in here for the last 150 years. This is, for me, why these kinds of altered states phenomena are so important. They don't fit inside this box. At the very least, they seem to suggest that the mind is bigger than the brain, that it rests on some deeper structure, that we, as conscious beings, are somehow all connected to. But they're exactly the kind of phenomena academics are obligated to ignore, since we have to think inside this idea of nature, taking this evolutionary self as our subject. And if this already imaginary self finds itself talking to other imaginary selves or imagines itself out of a body, evolutionary psychology says it was never in the first place, or maybe even at one with the universe. Physics tells me it bears no connection to whatsoever. And we have to assume that none of that actually happened, and the job is to explain why people think that it did. So, explain it away. Even people who have these experiences and hold these beliefs, in some sense, play by these same rules. By labeling these experiences spiritual or religious or supernatural, words that agree to leave them out of the description of nature. But at what point does this rhetorical division of reality get in the way of truly understanding it? In antiquity, people used to marvel at the sparks flying off of amber when they rubbed it and think, this object has some kind of a soul, until we get to the 18th century and people started collecting these sparks in Leyden jars, and suddenly we've harnessed the power of electricity. We have to ask ourselves, do these mystical, paracognitive, or just plain weird experiences really have nothing to tell us about how history works or even how reality works? Because at what point does not knowing start to make for bad politics? We made room for all the traditional religions, all the new spiritual and magical beliefs, but the story of humanity that we hold in common, this secular myth that we share, this we kept deliberately small. Isn't it time we really dared to know?